Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Gaps in Knowledge podcast on location. I'm Will, a history teacher who knows nothing about geography, and not with me is Reese, the geography teacher who knows nothing about history. That's because I'm currently sat in the Ardennes in South Belgium on my summer holidays, watching the house martins fly around a lovely château, which we managed to rent off AirBnB. And this week, I'm going to be doing something slightly different, so let's jump in. So I start, as ever, with Misconception Corner. And my misconception this week is slightly contentious because it's not really a matter of fact, more a point of debate. But my misconception is linked to where we are. We are just outside of the town of Bastogne, which was vital in the Second World War because in December of 1944, the Nazis tried to relieve pressure on the Western Front. Because in December of 1944, the Nazis basically lost the Second World War. They were completely surrounded from the west by the Allies who had invaded through Normandy, from the south by the Allies who had invaded through Italy, and from the east by the Soviets, who were, of course, part of the Allies, who had managed to overcome by the Soviets, who were, of course, part of the Allies, who managed to push all the way through to what is today roughly the German-Polish border. So the Nazis were, to put it bluntly, screwed. And they tried to launch a counterattack in exactly this part of the world. It was called the Battle of the Bulge. And the reason why it was called a bulge is because what Hitler wanted to do was to create a bulge in the line, a salient, as the technical term is, in order to cut off the Americans to the north and the British to the south, drive on through to the sea, and win the Second World War somehow. And that's kind of linked to what my misconception is, because whenever I teach this or whenever you talk to people about the Second World War, the question always arises, well, why didn't the Allies just try and assassinate Hitler? Wouldn't killing Hitler have been a good thing? Now, of course, getting rid of the Nazis was a good thing. That's fairly incontestable. And getting rid of the Nazis overall was the point of the Second World War. But my misconception is actually killing Hitler wouldn't have been that good a thing, certainly by 1944. Now, that sounds dodgy. I appreciate that. So let me explain. What you want in a wartime leader, not a leader of the army, but a leader of the country, is somebody who listens to their generals and somebody who pays attention to when they may be doing something wrong. What you don't want is someone who has no idea what they're doing, someone who believes that they are the greatest person in the world and knows exactly what they're doing, and somebody who will carry on with pig-headed stubbornness, regardless of what anybody else says. In Adolf Hitler, by 1944, that's exactly what the Germans had. Hitler believed he was sent by some power to restore the Germans to their rightful place at the top of the world. Hitler therefore believed that he didn't have to answer to anybody, least of all his generals, and he believed that his generals should do exactly what he told them. Now, the thing is, if you know about Hitler's background, which is quite a famous story, certainly amongst Brits, you'll know that his background was not military at all. He was fairly middling intellectually. He didn't do fantastically well at school. He left home at about 16, moved to Vienna where he was a failed artist. And if you look at his art, you'll see why, because in the time of, we've spoken about this before actually, in the time of Gustav Klimt and Richard Strauss, what you have is essentially paintings that are good for a shortbread box or a postcard that you'd send home, but certainly not interesting art. So he failed there. He kind of bimbled around for a few years, getting angrier and angrier before the First World War saved him from obscurity and turned him into a soldier. But he wasn't a leader. He was a corporal, and he wasn't a military mind. He was a messenger, more or less. So he had very limited experience with the military and no experience whatsoever in command, which meant that by the time you get to the Second World War, you have somebody who believes that they know exactly what they're doing, who actually has no idea what they're doing. And that works quite well for the Allies because he makes stupid mistakes. And one of the stupid mistakes he makes is the history of this local area. The Battle of the Bulge was a stupid mistake. The reason why it was a mistake is because, well, there are a few reasons. Number one, it's not going to work. If you think about what a battle line looks like, if you imagine you've got a map open in front of you, and on the left-hand side of that map, everything's painted blue, and on the right-hand side of that map, everything's painted red. That's more or less what the map of this part of the world looked like 80 years ago. And the blue is the Allies, and the red is the Axis powers, the Nazis. Now, if you picture on that line a bulge developing from right to left and a red line, the line getting bigger and the red forces pushing over to the left-hand side of that page, the good thing for the red side is that they're gaining more ground. The bad thing for the red side is that they've opened up their offensive line in such a way that makes it easier to attack them. What you never want in a fight is to be attacked from the side, because if you think about fighting somebody one-on-one, you're not going to turn away from them because they're just going to punch you in the side of the head. You've got to face up to them to see where your enemy is and to be able to maneuver around them. Now, if you get attacked from the side, you've got no chance of doing that. It's very, very easy to get surrounded, cut off, and therefore lose. What Hitler wanted to do was to create a bulge in the line that would divide the Americans from the British. But what that means he did is he created a bulge in the line that made it very, very easy for them to be attacked from the sides. Now, added into that, the second reason why this was a problem is that the Nazis simply didn't have the material or the manpower left. This attack took place in December of 1944. It's a bitterly cold winter, and as we know in hindsight, it's the final few months of the Second World War. And the reason why is because, as I mentioned before, Germany was completely surrounded and had no way of getting material in. The British in particular had done an excellent job of destroying Germany's synthetic oil refineries, which meant that, there's obviously no natural oil in Germany, so that meant that Germany had no fuel. And indeed, all the fuel that they managed to gather for the Battle of the Bulge was 6 million tons, which is enough to last them about a week. So what that means is that the Nazis need to attack with such force that within a week, they've captured their main goals, which is more fuel dumps and sufficient fuel dumps to fuel their artillery, their tanks, their people movers, their troop transports, as the advance continues north towards the sea. The problem is, that's just not going to happen, especially when you consider we're 5 years into the war. The veterans of the first few years are not stationed here if they're still alive. And as we'll see later on when we go and visit the German cemetery for the region, these troops were not seasoned, grisly old men. These were boys, essentially. You're lucky if they're over 20 years old. They don't really know what they're doing. So what you have is a bad plan by a bad leader, executed by boys who have no business being here. Now, how does that reinforce my first point? Well, if you get rid of Hitler and put someone competent in charge, there's no way they order this attack, because this attack is doomed to fail from the outset. Instead, what you get, if you choose a military mind, which the Nazis had enough common sense to do, Then maybe they negotiate a ceasefire. Maybe they manage to consolidate on one front. Maybe they figure out a way of dividing the Allies. Who knows? And there are many alternative histories written about this point. But what we can deal with is the truth of the matter, which is Hitler stayed in charge all the way through until the bitter end, until May 1945. And that meant he kept on making mistake after mistake after mistake. And the Battle of the Bulge that took place here was one of those mistakes. For sure. And when I say here, by the way, I have a little bit of local history, which is that the chateau I'm in at the moment was a key part of the Battle of the Bulge. General Patton, who was in charge of the American forces, stayed in the chateau one night, and one room is the room where he stayed is dedicated to him. But it was also the site of some fighting. That's because it was the headquarters of a part of the 101st Paratroopers for the American Army, who are the rather famous Band of Brothers. So if you've seen the TV show and you know towards the end of the TV show everything gets very, very cold and rather miserable, that's exactly where I am now. And they were stationed in this chateau. And so the chateau was shelled in the Second World War, and a jeep was blown up in the courtyard. Nobody was killed, fortunately. So my misconception is, if you kill Hitler, the Nazis actually get stronger. This kind of thinking that get rid of Hitler, win the Second World War, it's a bit misguided. Actually, keep Hitler, win the Second World War. Get rid of the Nazis, far better world. But Hitler, by 1945, certainly 1944, 1945, was more of a liability to the Nazis than he was a boon. So the funny thing about this chateau, which, as I mentioned, you can rent on Airbnb, and it's not ludicrously expensive. So if you want to stay in a chateau in Belgium, I'd highly recommend it. The funny thing about the chateau, called the Château de Roli, is I was leafing through some of the information about it here. There's not a huge amount. Quite a lot of it has been forgotten. It could have been built in the 9th century. It could have been built in the 12th century. We know that the tower was probably built sometime in the 14th or 15th century, and that the main body was built after 1733. But a lot of it's been forgotten. And that struck me as quite weird, because it's a whopping great big castle. And when I say it's a whopping great big castle, like, it's a proper manor house with a massive turret and gates, and the grounds are incredible. They're like a Belgian stourhead, if that means anything for you. There's 3 ponds in front of me now that I'm looking at, in the middle of a valley surrounded by woods of oak and pine and fir, and it's a remarkable place. And yet, we simply don't know that much about it. It's called the Château de Roli, Rolley. It was owned by the Roli family for a long time, until it was bought about 100 years ago. But most of it's been forgotten. And that struck me as odd, because this is a landscape where memory is a key feature of what's going on around here. This is Second World War territory, and you can't drive more than 5 minutes without coming across either a memorial or a signpost to a museum about the Battle of the Bulge. And so my topic for today's main feature is exactly that, memory and forgetting, and the role of memorials, because I don't have a story as such, although I do when we get to number time. I have a concept, and the concept isn't one that's particularly popular in English history or in British history, but it comes from French history. And the concept is that of lieux de mémoire, which is French for a remembrance site, or a place of memory is literally how you translate it. And it's not just a memorial. Anywhere can be a lieu de mémoire. But the idea is it's a place that evokes remembrance of a particular historical topic or site, or event, or personage. And so you can have a statue that is a lieu de mémoire. For example, the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol that is, I believe, currently at the bottom of the Avon, unless it's been fished out, which went from not really being a lieu de mémoire, being a remembrance site, because nobody really knew who Colston was, to being exactly the opposite of what it was intended, a site of memory about anti-slavery, about liberty and justice, and about debates around history. So lieu de mémoire, the basic idea is it's somewhere where you go in order to participate in history. Now, the most obvious version of those are war memorials, and perhaps the best example of a lieu de mémoire in the UK is the Cenotaph in the middle of Whitehall, which is a great big monolith designed by Edward. Oh, how do you pronounce his name? I've never learned how to pronounce his name. Leutens. I'll double check that. Commemorating the dead in the First World War. And every year, remembrance services on around November the 11th use the Cenotaph as a site of memory for the laying of wreaths and for the honouring of the people who were killed in the First World War in Britain. Now, as I mentioned before, the landscape here is studded with this kind of thing. And so I'm going to visit 3 of them today. And you're going to get a little bit of a field report. And the idea is I'll give you a description of them and I'll try and explain what kind of memory I feel like they're evoking and what kind of purpose they serve. So join me, if you will, on a trip around rural Belgium. You'll be very glad to hear, a gloriously sunny day with barely a cloud in the sky and the sun is beating down like mad. So pop your sun cream on, pack a hat, and I will see you over in Bastogne in a bit. So here we are at stop number 1. It's called the Mémorial de Martasson. It's on the outskirts of Bastogne. And let me describe the scene for you. So I'm standing in quite a large car park with some tour buses, one of which appears to be all the way from the Netherlands, and a whole load of cars. The car park's completely full. And there were some attendants at the front in yellow high-vis vests giving you tickets that you've got to go and then pay €5 at the desk for. In front of me is rather an ugly, modernist-ish low building, all angles and straight lines, and quite an ugly thing to have in the middle of the countryside, which says on the front of it, Bastogne War Museum. It costs €20 per person to go in. And in front of that is something quite incongruous, which I think kind of sums up the place, which is there are lumps of the Berlin Wall which have been graffitied on by various artists, which have nothing to do with Bastogne, nothing to do with the Second World War. And as far as I can see, none of the art has anything to do with the Berlin Wall itself. Very incongruous, very odd, kind of history related, but not really. The overall impression from the car park is this is a touristy place. There's toilets with big signs for the toilets. There's a pub around the corner with umbrellas advertising Belgian beer on them, and a restaurant. This is a place for lots of people to come and visit. And the reason why is just over the hill. So I'm going to head over to the memorial itself. So here is the memorial itself. And let me describe it to you, and I'll see if you can figure out who built it and what it's doing here. So it's a gigantic 5-pointed star, and written across the top of the star are the names of all 40, as far as I can tell, 49 states of the United States as they were in 1950 when it was built. On the inside, unfortunately, I can't actually get in to read what's on the inside because it's all scaffolded off. It's rather crumbling somewhat. Which there's a heavy-handed metaphor for you. But on the inside, there are a whole load of presidential seals and a whole load of text, which is a little bit illegible from here, so I can't quite read it for you. But what's very clear is what's being commemorated here, which is the US. There's no mention of the Second World War. There's no mention of Bastogne. Apart from a Belgian flag over to my left, there's no acknowledgement of the fact that this is in Belgium. This is a huge, huge structure which screams one thing, US power. And in terms of, therefore, how this functions as a lieu de mémoire, this doesn't really evoke the Second World War at all. It evokes the US. And so if you visit here, that's the impression that you get. This was all about the US, and the US were the most important part of the Second World War, which, to be fair, it was the US soldiers who were completely surrounded in Bastogne, as I mentioned previously, and it was the US who took the overwhelming majority of Allied casualties. But as a memorial to the Second World War, in my opinion, it doesn't particularly function because there is no information about the Second World War. There's no information about the Battle of Bastogne on the memorial itself. But I can see over to my right a little information board overlooking some hills. So I'm going to head over there and see what's going on. So I have in front of me, overlooking a very lovely view of the Belgian countryside, a rather large black map, which was erected roughly around the same time that the museum was built, as far as I can tell. And what it is, it's a silhouette of the hills here and of the villages and of the farmland, but with information as to where the boundary lines between each American division were and the direction in which the German soldiers were encircling Bastogne. Now, there's not a huge amount of information here, and it doesn't technically see itself as a memorial. This is information, not memorial. But what you can do very easily with it is spot a hill on the plaque, look up, see that same hill in the countryside, and imagine. And as a memorial for the Second World War, that for me works much better because you're using your imagination to place yourself in the shoes of the soldiers who were standing on this exact point 80 years ago, trying to figure out which bit's theirs, which bit's not theirs, and where the Germans are. And so, ironically, the memorial itself here, for me, doesn't really do a very good job of remembering the Second World War. And so as a lieu de mémoire, the memory here is American power. But this tiny little map, just overlooking the countryside, just suggesting, does a much, much better job of putting you in the shoes and therefore functioning as a memorial. Now, of course, the trouble is there's not a huge amount of information on it. We can see the name of a couple of the divisions that fought here, but there's no information about the individuals and no information about the outcome. But if we're thinking about how do lieux de mémoire function, which is kind of the idea of what I'm doing here, then if you're trying to evoke, well, it depends on what you're trying to evoke. If you're trying to evoke a feeling of what it was like to be an individual here and a feeling of what war is actually like, then this way of using your imagination is very effective. If we're trying, however, to evoke gratitude and power, then the massive star to America, which really could be picked up and plonked down anywhere in the world and would still function, then that's the kind of architecture you want to go for, and that's the kind of impact you want to have. So lieux de mémoire are very highly, or remembrance sites are very highly dependent on what you actually want to remember. And in this case, it certainly seems that what the Americans wanted people to remember was America. So we're off next to an extremely different place. It's called the Recogne-Bastogne Cemetery, and I shall head over there and describe it for you. So I'm at the Recogne-Bastogne Cemetery, and it's, as I said before, the mood here is completely different. As we drove through the little hamlet of Recogne, there was another cemetery, the local cemetery on the left, and that was a Catholic cemetery, being it was part of the world, and it was full of enormous memorials. And as you drive down the hill, you could very, very easily miss this cemetery, also on the left of the road, because there's a little pink sandstone wall, and there's a line of oak trees. And apart from that, there's not a huge amount here to suggest that what you're looking at is a war memorial. And the reason why is because in February of 1945, the locals and the American army began the job of clearing up the German bodies, and this is where they were buried. Originally, there were some 3,000 bodies buried here, alongside about 3,000 American bodies, but the American bodies were shipped out in 1948, and more German bodies were added. So there's some 6,800 Germans buried here. And let me describe it for you. It's a gently undulating field studded with very large oaks, and spaced every metre and a half in long lines of about 30 are headstones, little crosses made out of slate or granite, some grey stone. And on the front of each cross are 3 names, and each of those names has 2 dates, the date of birth and the date of death. And So that obviously what that means is there are 3 men buried in each of these graves. Now, the thing is, and the thing that caught my breath as I walked around, is if you go around the back of each headstone, you'll see that the back is also inscribed with 3 names. And a lot of the men are unnamed. It just says ein deutscher Soldat, which means a German soldier. So that means that their remains couldn't be identified. And if you do some quick maths on the year of birth and year of death, first of all, you can see the year of death is almost always December 1944, January 1945. And the year of birth is either around 1926, 1927, or around 1900, which means that the men here are either 17 and 18 or in their late 40s. The reason why is, as I mentioned previously in the number time section, that this was the final throw of the dice pretty much for the Third Reich, and by this time they simply didn't have trained soldiers left. All they had left were the men who were too old to sign up previously in the war, too infirm to do so, or too young. And so the vast majority of the men here who were buried wouldn't have had their first shave at the time that the First World War broke out in 1939. And yet here they are 6 years later being buried in the same war in Belgium. It's a very, very somber place. And it feels like quite a forgotten place. There is an information board outside, but it makes barely any mention of the cemetery here. It doesn't give much information. In fact, the information I had to research online. Instead, it talks about the local town and the suffering of the local town. There is also a chapel here, and in the chapel there are some memorials to both named soldiers who are buried here and to unnamed soldiers. There's a poem here which I'm going to try and read in my terrible German, on a photo that said zwei unbekannte deutsche Soldaten. So it's a gravestone for 2 unknown soldiers. And it said, ich bin nicht mehr und bleibe doch bei euch. In euren Herzen will ich auferstehen. Which, auferstehen, I'm not entirely sure of, but it means something along the lines of, I'm no longer here, but I'll always stay with you in your hearts. And so it's a very deeply affecting and moving place. And so as a lieu de mémoire, there's absolutely no glory here, which is very much to be expected. These men were, let's not forget, invaders and destroyers, and they are buried in the country that they invaded. However, there is also a sense of pity that what was the option for these men? They could either go and fight, or, well, I say men, they're boys really, most of these people, they're 17 or 18 years old, they had no idea what they were doing. And the option was either head off and fight, or get sent to a labour camp, or perhaps even just get shot on sight. So what choice do they have? The real takeaway that I take from this is these people just shouldn't have been here in the first place, and their failing pales in comparison to the failing of the politicians. The currency for war is the lives of these young men and the blood that they spilled. And therefore, as a lieu de mémoire, as a site of memory, the individual soldier here is somewhat important, and there's the odd wreath laid here and there by presumably family or descendants. But it's mostly about the impact of this place, the overall impact of this place, which is these people shouldn't have been here in the first place, because the whole thing should never have happened in the first place, because the Second World War began long, long before 1939, and the price that was paid in Europe for this was far, far too high. And that's why, as we've mentioned before, we have things like the EU and Eurovision and the Euros, because otherwise this kind of thing happens. So it's a very, very different feeling. And the memorial here is much more somber, much less, I suppose, aggressive. Somewhat disrespectful in that there are 3 men buried in each grave and then 3 more on the other side, so 6 men to a headstone. Understandably so, but more expressing regret that this should ever happen. So from here, I'm off to my next stop, which is the third and final site of remembrance in the region that I'm interested in. So I'll see you there. So here we are at the final stop. It's called the Bois de la Paix, which is the wood of peace, peace wood. And this is way off the main road. The road into the Bastogne War Museum and the Martasson Memorial was enormous. And it's very heavily signposted right from the centre of town. The Bastogne Cemetery isn't signposted even at the site itself. There's just nothing there apart from a very small car park. And here it is signposted, but the road itself is very piddly, and it reminds me of roads down in the southwest of the UK. We had to pull over to let a tractor pass, for example, and there's cows in the field opposite. Very, very rural. But in front of me is a great big fir forest, and beyond that I can see a clearing, and in there is where the Bois de la Paix is. So I'm going to head in and I will describe it for you. Well, this is quite an interesting place actually, because it's a very, very big clearing, clearly artificial because it's completely circular, and there's trees everywhere, but the trees have been planted in a very specific way, which I'll explain in a minute. It was built in 1994, and it was built by the locals here in Bastogne, and the idea behind it is they've planted trees to commemorate the 50th anniversary. It's quite arbitrary the way they've planted the trees, because underneath each of the birch trees to my left is a little plaque, and the name of the plaque isn't the name of the people who were killed in the Battle of the Bulge. It's the name of the veterans who came back to celebrate the 50th anniversary. So they've been commemorated, and there's about 4,000 of them here. And alongside those to the right, there are other trees commemorating every single one of the divisions that took part in the Battle of the Bulge. And beyond that, there are more trees which are more general memorials. So, for example, there's a tree to prisoners of war, there's a tree to the resistance, there's a tree to the widows of the war. So this is an obvious site of personal commemoration, and for the first time for the Allied side you do get a sense of the men who fought here. And indeed some of the trees have photos attached to them. In fact, there's one over there that I'm just going to go and take a closer look at. So underneath this beech tree here, there's the plaque says Lieutenant Everett G. Andrew, and their family, Lieutenant Andrew's family has left a picture here of him. It says Red Andrew, which was clearly his nickname. And there's a photo of him here in 1945, and there's a photo of him from much more recently. And they've left a little garden here, very small kind of plant pot style garden with some decorations in it and things. So this is an active site of remembering specific individuals. There was that to an extent over at Recogne in the German cemetery, but there were very, very few specific individual memorials there. For the most part, the graves were left unadorned, but here there's quite a few. And so this is clearly a very personal site of remembrance. And around the outside are plaques to various cities that were destroyed in the Second World War, places like Lublin, Kiev, Coventry, each of which have trees, a specific species of tree around them. So Kiev, for example, has horse chestnuts, and Guernica has some oaks. And the idea behind this place is, well, it's twofold. Well, threefold maybe. One is it does give an individual side to memory, and that's something that I find very effective, and I think that's why the individual memorials such as graveyards or memorials that have the names of people on them seem to work very effectively. And by individualizing it, you can get a sense of what these people went through and how vast an enterprise this was, and therefore obviously just how much death there was. Here it does work slightly differently because these men weren't killed, they came back 50 years later, and so this is only a small slice of the war. But by growing trees, you do therefore get a sense of the scale, because you can take in a forest very, very easily and see just how large it is. And if this is only a small slice of a small slice of a small part of the Second World War, and yet it's really rather a large forest, it would take you about half an hour to walk around it. It really goes to show just how vast the Second World War was, just how much death there was. but beyond that, just how many people were involved in it. And there's some information here about the American soldiers. It tells you that about 1,500 men were killed, 3,000 were missing, and 7,000 were wounded. I thought it interesting that it noted underneath the number of German victims is slightly smaller, but it doesn't give a specific figure for German victims, which again I think is linked to the fact that they were the invaders and they were responsible for the destruction of this place. But as a site of memorial, then, it's clearly about the individual because of the individual names on the individual trees. It is also about evoking a sense of the warfare, though, and the warfare that took place here was done, A, in the middle of winter, and B, in the thick of forests. And if you've ever walked through a forest by yourself, you'll know there is a sense in which you're slightly on edge because you can't see very far and you don't know what's out there. And if you know what's out there is German invaders ready to kill you without you even seeing them, then the site of the Ardennes forest becomes a real site of terror. Now, if you take that site of terror and transform it into a war memorial, then you completely change the way in which this local landscape is seen, both by the veterans who came back and by the people who live here. And I think that's one of the goals here. This forest is literally called the Wood of Peace, the Peace Wood. And it's transforming the wood of war into something calm, gentle, very, very quiet. And that's exactly what it is. There is no sound here apart from there's some children playing off over on the other side of the clearing. Beyond that, it's just the sound of the wind in the leaves and the odd cricket in the grass. It's a very, very peaceful place. But I think there's something metaphorical going on here as well, the third aspect of this memorial, which is growth and development. And the trees, as they grow and as they shed their leaves and as they die and as they rot and as they regrow, will be here until someone comes along and chops them down, which hopefully will be never. Therefore, they will be here forever. And therefore, as a memorial, this is both individual and perpetual and mass and peaceful. And so the message here isn't, here's what it was like to fight in the war. The message here is, what do we do now that the war's over? And for us, 30 years on from when this memorial was made, what do we do now that the war is passing from living memory? And it's obviously a far bigger question for me on this podcast. But as a site of growth, as a site of peace, and as a site of quiet, I think this does a very good job of answering those questions. So I'm back in my castle now, and maybe you can hear the birds in the background, and maybe hear the weir down there in the pond. And it's been a very hot day, but it's been a very interesting day to see how the most tumultuous event in this town's history, by far and away the most important event in this town's history, is still being commemorated as the original men who fought in the Second World War are more or less passing from living memory into the history books. And the different ways in which the different combatants in this war have been memorialized, it's fairly obvious, but it is worth pointing out because it helps you understand how memorials function and why they function. And the idea isn't just the event itself, it's the way in which the event itself is being represented. And so the American War Memorial, it wasn't actually really about the event itself. It was about the memorial to the United States, and not to the individual soldier, but to the United States. There were plaques up to each division, which unfortunately have been taken off for cleaning at this point. And as I mentioned before, there was a bit of a heavy-handed metaphor available should you wish to understand it, which is that the edifice of that memorial was crumbling and inside was looking pretty rotten and pretty hollow. So comparing that to the German War Memorial, how does memory function there? Well, as a very sad place, a very devastating place, a very moving place. I reflected when I was there that this is my 7th year as a teacher. And so the first people that I taught are now turning 24 and 25. And so they are too old to be in that cemetery. The people who I taught last year and the year before are the people who would have been in that cemetery 80 years ago. So it's a strange sight because you feel a huge amount of sympathy for these people, but you also wish that they just weren't here in the first place, because the devastation that they wrought for a cause in which many of them wouldn't have believed in, some of them may well have done. Some of them would have been brought up on Nazi propaganda after all, having spent the entirety of their life more or less under the Nazis. It may not be their fault, but that doesn't excuse the fact that they were responsible for destroying this part of the world. And I think that's summed up very well in the memorial. It is sad, it is somber, it is moving, but there's no glory there. There's just shame and sorrow and pity. But comparing that to the Bois de la Paix, the Peace Wood, that's a much more hopeful place. So there isn't really a story to this. There will be a story for my final segment for today. But the idea is, when you're looking at a memorial, or when you're looking at a plaque, or when you're looking at something commemorating something else, it could be a photograph, it could be a city, it could be anything. The question isn't just what's being commemorated. The question is, what am I expected to feel here and why? And that tells us a lot, not just about the site itself and the event itself, but about the people who constructed the monument. Because monuments are a really important part of history. They're often the most visible part of history, and especially when you drive through any village in the UK, there will be a memorial to men who fought in the First and probably the Second World War as well. How are they being commemorated? Why are they being commemorated in that way? And what message is that sending down the generations? That's how lieux de mémoire function. So, hopefully my tramps around the Belgian countryside have been somewhat entertaining, and if not, stay tuned for number time, because I have a story involving some nuts. See you there. So it's number time. My number for you this week is 1, specifically one word, and the topic is the encirclement of Bastogne. See if you can figure it out from that as I tell you the story. What happened here, as I've mentioned before, is that the Germans completely encircled this town. It was cut off entirely, and stuck inside were a whole load of American troops, thousands of American troops, as well as, of course, the civilians here. And the American troops were led by a man called General Anthony McAuliffe, also known as Nuts McAuliffe. And the reason why will become clear in a bit. So on December the 22nd, the leader of the German troops in the area, a guy called von Luttwitz, sends a message to General McAuliffe. And I'll read you a little bit now. It says, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been completely encircled. The whole of the area is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save your troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town." Now, what they're proposing here is that the Americans become prisoners of war and then get sent back. The trouble is, the Germans have already been known to shoot prisoners of war, which is completely against all the laws of war, but hey, they're Nazis. What did you expect? So the Americans, they know that if they surrender, they'll probably get shot. They also know that if they can hold out, then there are American troops not far away, also in Belgium, a couple of dozen miles away, who may be able to relieve them in the near future. And so what Nuts McAuliffe does is, when he's given the message, he reads it, crumples it up, and throws it in the bin and says, "Nuts." And so the officers will kind of stand around saying, well, how do we write this official reply? And McAuliffe says, no, you don't need to write anything else. Here's what you reply. To the German commander, "Nuts. the American commander. Send that off. And that's what they sent off. Now, what does nuts mean in this case? It means essentially go to hell, F off. McAuliffe didn't swear because he's a very religious man, and so nuts was his version of F off. And so this is given to the Germans, and the Germans presumably are very confused by this message. Nuts, what is nuts? Who is nuts? Where are nuts? Nussen, what? But what McAuliffe has done is called their bluff. And what he didn't know was that the Germans simply didn't have the firepower to actually crush Bastogne. So he'd successfully called their bluff. 4 days later, the Americans are relieved by American troops coming in and kicking out the Germans from the area. And by the middle of January, the Battle of the Bulge is completely lost for the Germans, and the march is on to destroy Nazi Germany, essentially. So what Nuts McAuliffe did was play an extremely high-stakes game of poker and win outright. The thing is with an event so massive like the Second World War is that wherever you go around the world that was touched by the Second World War, there'll be little stories like this. So they're always worth seeking out. If you go anywhere in continental Europe, you'll be able to find a little story. But you will, of course, come across the more somber side of things, because let's not forget just how many people were killed in the Second World War. So this is a very interesting, very lovely part of the world, one well worth recommending. And if you do feel like coming to Belgium, do see if you can get the château on AirBnB, because it's excellent. So that's all from me this week. Normal service will hopefully be resumed next time around, where I may allow a little bit of geography in. So I shall see you then. Bye.